All right. Well, welcome, friends. Thank you to everyone who is joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn, Why Land Return to Indigenous Nations, discussions on the Wáhsehtəkw or Penobscot East River Branch Project and beyond. And thanks to everybody who is watching this recording on YouTube. There are many ways to think about the growing movement for returning land to Indigenous nations, and many points of connection between land return and the overall well-being of tribal communities. Whether we use the lens of environmental and climate justice, food sovereignty, health, economic justice, or a holistic combination of them all, rematriating land is about rebuilding traditional Indigenous stewardship and caretaking practices in ancestral places. Centering Indigenous leadership, knowledge, and decision-making in conservation work also represents conservation best practices, resulting in the most effective ways to conserve lands productively for climate resilience and biodiversity. Right now, the Trust for Public Land is working to restore nearly 30,000 acres to the Penobscot Nation while creating access to Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. And we have an incredible panel with us today to share more about the Wáhsehtəkw project. Dr. Darren Ranco is an anthropologist and chair of the Native American programs at the University of Maine. Charles Loring Jr. is Natural Resources Director with the Penobscot Nation. And Betsy Cook is the Maine State Director at the Trust for Public Land. We are so grateful to have all of you with us today. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate, and MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. It is also my favorite part of the week, every week, and I am grateful to all of you for making it possible. A few notes before we dive in today. We will hear from each of our speakers first and then tackle questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait, though. You can send questions through the chat to me or to Maggie Summers at any point. We will synthesize them and ask as many as possible following the presentation. We ask that you not message our speakers directly so they can keep their focus on the presentation and not the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties during the program, Maggie Summers is the one to help you out. Just send her a message and she will work her magic. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You can always find recordings of all of our programs on YouTube, where a number of playlists help you focus in on particular topics. I think that covers it. And thank you all again for joining us. And Darren, you are going to start things off, so I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Really happy to be here today. And I'm actually an alum of this Lunch and Learn. I think I was in one of the early ones, and that was it was great. You guys run a great program here, and it's just really great to be able to
One of the fun things about Zoom is that question of, is this a dramatic pause or a frozen moment? I think we might be in the latter, but we're gonna be patient and Darren, I don't know if you can maybe try turning off your camera and see if that helps with connectivity.
Okay, so looks like
Back in.
he'll be right back on. Yes, yes.
I really love that we are always finding new little glitches in this virtual world. So thanks for your patience, and Darren will be right back with us. Here he comes.
Hello, sorry.
Welcome back.
Well, that was a real glitch in the matrix for me. I apologize, everyone. Yes, this is such an honor to be sharing with you all today. And let's see here. Hopefully you can, I'll try not to press whatever it is I pressed before. Okay, so great. The goals of today is I do want to talk about some key frames that we use to talk about land return. Just some short definitions around land back and rematriation, how those are interconnected to the work that we do. I'll introduce the Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship and its facilitation role, along with the First Light learning journey of really made this kind of work possible in what is now Maine. I don't have a ton of time to understand the legacy of stolen lands across our territory, but I do want to kind of touch on that because especially the East Branch project, well, the Wáhsehtəkw, is really in a certain area that has some of that legacy of stolen lands, and answer why is land return important for not just Indigenous people, but for the earth and for all of us. So yeah, the definitions around, and these are terms might be new for some of you, might not be for others. The idea that you know, land back as a kind of political movement and rematriation as a set of cultural practices are really interconnected. They both center for Indigenous people the right relationships between humans and non-humans. Land back is much more an anti-colonial or decolonial project. It emphasizes the return of everything stolen from us as Indigenous peoples, our land, our language, ceremonies, medicines, kinship, etc. And rematriation, on the other hand, or interconnected with that, those set of returns, is really centering women and cultural traditions, not men and property relations from the Western colonial order. And it's really a self-conscious shift around the status quo of sort of capitalism and land as property, and really emphasizing healing as a set of relationships between humans and non-humans. So the commission is actually made up of 2 representatives from each of our 5 tribal governments. In what is now Maine, there are 2 Passamaquoddy tribal governments at the 2 reservation sites in Washington County, but I wanted to just make sure you all knew kind of where that where those locations are. There's also, oh, hold on. Keep in mind that there is oh, sorry. our territory stretches across what I would call the Wabanaki, the greater Wabanaki territory, in the sort of northeastern part of Turtle Island. And many of our nations, fellow Wabanaki nations, exist across the border, the medicine line, into what is now referred to as Canada. And the 29 Micmac, 1 Passamaquoddy, 6 Maliseet, 2 Abenaki bands are part of our confederacy and a part of our traditional territory. One thing in our collective work and First Light in the Wabanaki Commission that we really like to emphasize is this history, ongoing history of claims and exclusions that even the map of conserved and parklands in Maine, which we often kind of point to as lands that are still very limited in our access and rematriation and healing responsibility, caretaking roles. We don't have that much access to those lands, but they are a part of a kind of promise in our collective work with land trusts and in the land return movement, especially here in what is now Maine. I like to put on this map to see that, you know, the idea that led to our 1980 Settlement Act was that there had been a series of illegal treaties signed after 1790 with the state of Massachusetts mostly, and a little bit with the new state of Maine. And that has a legacy of 12 million acres taken, but the locations of where we had the clearest treaty rights that were violated to lands and where current conserved and park lands, protected lands is an overlap. And that reflects the, you know, much deeper history I don't have time for of, you know, exclusion of Indigenous people often went along with conservation and creation of parks, national parks, all those sorts of things. And, you know, you can consult those histories online if you choose to. I just want to, you know, point out the commission. It is again an entity created and supported by the 5 tribal governments, 4 tribal nations, and it's really again health and well-being is the focus of the work. Through a sustained effort to expand our access, management, ownership of lands, to practice our land-based cultures. The idea of returning land, and you know, it's motivated by this, which I would say is the core of rematriation work, and not because we just love owning land, right? So this is really about our caretaking responsibilities, our health and well-being, and then more broadly, the health and well-being of the planet and all of us. So we're doing this by acquiring land, sharing, co-managing, and working with land trusts and conservation organizations. And we really seek to create, along with our First Light partners, this kind of education, partnership, stronger conservation movement that includes and reflects Wabanaki expertise and perspective, which for so long has not. And I think this last 5 years, 6, maybe almost 7 years now, really reflects a huge move in movement in our ability to partner with land trusts and conservation groups. Just the Wáhsehtəkw project that we'll talk more about is just one of, and this might be a couple months old now, one of many projects that we are working on in terms of land return. It is by far the biggest and probably has this, you know, really important cachet. But I think understanding that these projects are about all of our nations having land return, and that we are engaged in a very, you know, set of projects, I think is important. This is reflected a little bit in the map of where, you know, where the possibilities and locations are. And this is just a categorization that we sometimes use to kind of say, like, there are various stages of this work in engaging with our partners for land return. The majority of those green lands are lands that we were able to purchase as a part of the 1980 Settlement Act, though. So if you look in the center part of that map. So we kind of consider that as part of this, although the ramifications of that Settlement Act and impacting our sovereignty have been quite negative. I do want to, this isn't exactly my story to tell, but First Light Learning Journey, which many of you know, has been a critical organizer and educator around the possibilities around land return, and is really about building new partnerships for land return and rematriation. The delegation of First Light is represented by these organizations that are very familiar for many of you, and so many more. It actually, there have been, I think, something like 60 to 65 of the conservation land trust groups in Maine out of the 85 have participated in some way with First Light learning or fundraising or any of those kinds of, as well as other foundations and other groups. So it's had a huge impact around the collective work around conservation across the state. One thing I do want to share, and because this is, well, I've been traveling around this last year, being on sabbatical, engaging with other tribal nations who are doing this work, and having a First Light as an organization and as a facilitator of this work, and doing it in a way where they're relearning, recentering, and returning land. In that vision is that a commitment to returning land without cost and without restriction and with a fund to help care for it is a set of radical ideas that I'm sure we can talk about more. I will say, again, not trying to do business as usual, also recognizing that land trusts, a number of them were testifying against our sovereignty not that long ago. They're all huge supporters of it now, but I will say that, that learning curve is a really important part of understanding of the practice of this work and what the core of it is. So I do want to, in terms of the East Branch project, one parts of our lands as Penobscot Nation that we, in treaty after treaty, starting actually in the 18th century and going into the 19th century, with these 4 townships, which are key hunting territories, which don't exactly overlap, but they're very close to the area that Wáhsehtəkў represents in terms of those 30,000 acres. And if you read the treaties and you read how hard we fought to retain these lands and how important they were culturally to us in terms of these 4 townships, I think you get a sense of why this is so important. It's like the core of our hunting and fishing territory is what Wáhsehtəkў represents. Re-engaging and caretaking in these lands represents a healing that the harm, really goes back to the 1830s when the state of Maine just basically illegally seized these 4 townships. And to make this right, 200 years, almost 200 years later, is a really significant progress. I think Betsy and Chuck might talk a little bit about this, but in terms of the acreage and the miles of rivers and streams and just how important the land is to us as Penobscot people is so critical. Yeah, and here's the map. Maybe I flipped the, here's the map of where this is. It actually connects current tribal land holdings in the grindstone area, and connects that to actually the national monument, the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. So it gives this sense of access into the Katahdin region as Penobscot Nation people. That's really, really important in terms of our cultural landscape and how important the Katahdin area is for our nation, but also all the other Wabanaki tribes as well. I think people ask like why land return, and I have a much longer presentation where I go into the ideas that conservation practitioners, land trust practitioners are recognizing, and this is in scholarship, and as a scholar I'm adding to this all the time, but that the best results for conservation and protections of biodiversity are when Indigenous people are either the holders or the directors, or their governance is enhanced. And we see this in paper after paper in the last decade. And that's sort of fulfilling this promise and understanding that, we actually share the key goals of conservation and land trusts as Indigenous people, and fulfilling our caretaking responsibilities is really where it's at, and understanding why this is seeking a healing project as well as a healing project for the planet and for all of us, and dealing with the ways in which colonial legacies have actually created many of the environmental and biodiversity challenges that we face currently. So I just want to say that. Happy to take more questions on that. Just, you know, in terms of a call, what can I do? You know, you can support this return directly through the TPL. There's the website there. You can also support our engagement and work through the Wabanaki Commission, which also has a rematriation fund that we refer to in the Passamaquoddy language as the take good care of what is returned fund. So I think that's a really important thing you can support, as well as our model of interdependence and working as Wabanaki and land trusts in this space. And we'll hear more about that with the TPL project. And I just want to say that this is the most important work that any of us or that I can be involved with. It's healing and heart work for my nation, but the planet as well. It goes up against and challenges all these colonial structures and legacies. But the fact that we can see like the healing around these 4 townships, perhaps taken from us in the 1830s, and to address that in 2024 is just a phenomenal and hopeful message. And I really think it's transformational in what we can all do together. So really thinking about caretaking and what that means for conservation work going forward in the next 200 years will be really critical, I think. So I'll end there. I think I kind of hit my time. We'll see. And I think Betsy may be next, but I'll end my show. I'll stop sharing and hand it over to, I think, Betsy.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Darren. And can folks see these slides? Looking good?
That's great, Betsy, thanks.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Darren. My name is Betsy Cook. I am the Maine State Director for the Trust for Public Land. And I really, as a great segue to the Wáhsehtəkw project that Chuck and I are going to share on, I want to recognize the foundational work that the Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship and that First Light has laid, and the continued guidance that both of those entities provide with respect to the larger picture of land return, land back, and rematriation, and how this project helps to advance those bigger goals. So definitely a project that we're about to talk about that's being done within a much larger context here that Darren hit on. So a little bit about Trust for Public Land. We are committed to connecting people to the outdoors to create healthier, more equitable, and more climate resilient communities. And with that North Star, TPL has a specific focus through our Tribal and Indigenous Lands Initiative on efforts and partnerships that reconnect Indigenous communities and land. For over 30 years, TPL has partnered with more than 70 tribes and Indigenous-led organizations to restore connection to land to more than 200,000 acres. And as many of you know, access to land is not equitable. There are deep disparities in which communities realize the benefits of connection to and access to land. And across the continent, as Darren touched on, Indigenous communities have been systematically disconnected from their land. In present-day Maine, Wabanaki nations currently legally steward only 1% of their ancestral homelands. So as a step towards addressing that inequity, TPL is really honored to be working in partnership with Penobscot Nation to return nearly 30,000 acres of land to Penobscot Nation, known as the Wáhsehtəkw land. We are notably working on this goal with the intention of ensuring that Penobscot Nation's self-determination and sovereignty is maintained and strengthened. So the result of returning land is just as important as the manner in which the project is being undertaken to ensure that Penobscot Nation continues to have sovereignty and self-determination over the land that the nation stewards. And as Darren mentioned, this project also aspires to create new southern access into Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument, which is a critical need. And I'll speak more about the partnership opportunities there between Penobscot Nation and the National Park Service. So in order to make this project successful, we are working on a multi-year campaign to raise $32 million from public and private sources. And this represents one of the largest land return or land back efforts between a tribal nation and nonprofit organization in US history. One of the powerful aspects of this effort is the connectivity between the Wáhsehtəkw land and the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. And the National Park Service and Department of Interior are supporting this project at the highest level as a model of collaboration between Park Service units and tribal lands, and as a model of looking to Indigenous-led leadership for conservation and land caretaking. The Park Service has named protection of Penobscot homeland as one of the primary goals of Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. And just this past summer, Penobscot Nation and the Park Service signed a general agreement for co-stewardship processes on Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. So as we think about the future of conservation, both from a nonprofit perspective, but also from the perspective of the US federal government, you can see through projects like this one and the support I just mentioned, how important it is for the Park Service and Department of Interior to be supporting Indigenous-led conservation efforts and land return. And I want to highlight some of the benefits of the Wáhsehtəkw project and land return in general, and land being reconnected with Indigenous nations. So one of the key goals here is around land justice. And as I mentioned, Wabanaki nations legally steward only 1% of their ancestral homelands. And so restoring access to this land in an equitable and just manner helps ensure that everyone has access to the importance of natural resources and the outdoors. Darren mentioned that the scholarship and the research shows the increased climate and environmental benefits from Indigenous-led conservation and land return efforts. And just as a way of example, Penobscot Nation's sustainable forest management will likely yield about 810,000 tons of carbon sequestered on this property, which is very significant for climate benefits. And that's equivalent to the amount of carbon emitted by about 180,000 cars in a given year. So just the stewardship approach that Penobscot Nation takes on all of their lands and will take on this land will result in those strong climate benefits. With respect to economic well-being, there's really key benefits for the nation from sustainable forest management and direct funding that will help to support the health and well-being of the nation. And there are also strong economic benefits to the Millinocket, East Millinocket, and other surrounding towns that come from increased outdoor recreation use and access into the monument. And Darren spoke to cultural reconnection and increased health and well-being outcomes. Chuck can enhance on this, but just to provide an example with the Wáhsehtəkw project, this 30,000 acres of land will create new areas for Penobscot Nation to gather subsistence species, including moose and brook trout and other fisheries, which in turn will result in stronger health and well-being outcomes for citizens. And then the access to the outdoors that can come through this access into Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument is critical to general health and well-being of connecting people to land and to the outdoors. And lastly, increased social cohesion. Research has shown that providing access to land results in stronger social ties within communities. So within a community like Penobscot Nation and between communities. So hopefully that benefit will be realized in a major way here. So I'm happy to now pass along to Chuck Loring, and Chuck is going to speak a bit more about the stewardship and caretaking approach of the nation.
All right. Thank you, Betsy, and good afternoon. Chuck Loring, I'm the Director of Natural Resources for the Penobscot Nation. The nation has stewarded the lands of this area for thousands of years, and we were once far more numerous in our presence. Today, the nation still stewards around 128,000 acres of our traditional lands, many of which are located within the Penobscot watershed. The Wáhsehtəkw lands are located adjacent to historic hunting lands, which are most closely described today as T3 and T4 Indian Purchase, Mattawamkeag, and Woodville in their present names. These hunting lands were last affirmed in the treaty between Massachusetts and the Penobscot Nation on July 29th of 1818. Getting land back in this area has many benefits for the nation. Some of the coldest waters come from the headwaters of the East Branch of the Penobscot, and they are thought to be some of the most climate resilient waters in the state as well. There are a number of wild and scenic stretches along the East Branch, as well as fewer fish passage hurdles to overcome for spawning Atlantic salmon to access their preferred habitat as well. And next slide. And so here's a picture of when we were out doing some Atlantic salmon releases on some of the lands in Mattamasconis. Figured I'd describe those first. But tribal stewardship of land affords many different opportunities that are not available to private and industrial ownership. Not only is it possible to restore ecosystems, but also restore their relatives to their native habitat as well. The Penobscot Nation Department of Natural Resources has a significant reputation for being involved with many great projects, and with recent developments like the Biden administration creating opportunities like the Executive Order 14112, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act, with specific tribal set-aside pots. We've been able to leverage several funds to line us up for years of restoration and habitat assessment work on the Wáhsehtəkw lands, as well as other Penobscot opportunities. Next slide. You can go to the fourth one, I think. There you go. Thank you. This slide's a little personal, but it gives a glimpse into how I interact with the land and is a reminder of why I do what I do and why many of us do what we do. In these photos, you'll see my daughter River. She has grown from 7 weeks old in one of the images standing over the recently harvested moose there, up until she was 3 years old, which is the picture furthest to the right. We spend a lot of time in the woods together, hunting and gathering for our family to supplement our subsistence. I mean, it's no secret that we have day jobs and we still go to the grocery store quite a bit, but we also find ourselves harvesting a lot of meat from the lands, as well as mushrooms and other items. But if River and I aren't on tribal land looking for moose or dropped antlers, we find ourselves on our woodlot behind our house, or a recently purchased new farm near our home in Corinth. We rarely buy meat other than chicken or fish, and I wouldn't even need to buy the fish if it wasn't for a variety of contaminants that are found in the fish in our river, like mercury, dioxins, furans, and PCBs. Now PFAS is a growing concern, and we're looking into that as well. As Betsy mentioned earlier, this will provide opportunities for specific species that we rely upon, including moose, but also she mentioned brook trout, and those are actually some of the safest fish to eat in the state. And it's also important to mention that holding land and stewarding land makes it possible for us to practice traditional life ways in a private manner, where we are hunting amongst our families, and for not only this generation, but also 7 generations out. Next slide. And thank you. I just want to say a little bit about this photo too. This photo I took with my drone over, from Poplar Mountain on our land in Carabasset Valley, looking towards the Bigelows. And as you know, the Bigelows are part of the state preserve land. And I really like the drone images because, it shows raw land kind of contextualized as it should be without boundaries. And that's also kind of a similar shot to what's in the background behind me here. And thank you. I'll pass it off to Kathleen.
Thank you all so much. I'm really appreciating these photos. Chuck, and your daughter is adorable. Thank you for sharing. And just really helping reinforce how personal and how deeply felt this is. Darren, I loved the way you referred to this as healing and heart work and the future of the planet. It's a heavy time to be thinking about all of the work we have ahead, and it is just a real joy to be talking about this today with you all. So thank you. As Maggie said in the chat, you are going to get all of the links that you saw going by in slides. You'll get those in a follow-up email. I hope you'll click on all of them, and I hope you will especially take some time to think about supporting this project, because we'll send you the information to make it easy. And I think it's, it's just such an incredible project. I'm really excited to dig into a few of your questions, and I want to start off by saying, Darren, thank you so much for starting with definitions. As you were talking, I realized, oh, I think I was conflating land back and rematriation and using those terms interchangeably. It sounds like those things go hand in hand, but they are not interchangeable. Is it closer to accurate to say it's like land back is about the land and rematriation is about how you take care of it? Am I getting closer?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's like, I mean, this is just me, I'm trying to, really professor it up here and make it as bright a line as possible, just so people can follow. But, there are different definitions of both of these terms, and the hashtag of land back, I think is that broader category of sort of fighting the system to get back something. But I think, what motivates and really is why we're doing it is more on that cultural project, the rematriation side. And I think we all know when you bring something back that you haven't had, relationships have changed and there's work, and I think that's and that's, in some ways, it's new work for us as Wabanaki people, as Indigenous people. Return it's been really going the other way pretty hard in the last couple hundred years. So bringing things back and mobilizing our communities and cultures and diplomacies to kind of do that has been, really helpful, and yet a tremendous amount of work. And I just want to say, but I think the definitions are important because, in some ways, returning land allows for the return of oftentimes ceremonies, right? That we haven't been able to go to those lands and do, so I think that idea that even what gets returned and how those are interconnected to other things that we are working on returning and healing from, those are also really important interrelations too. And I just want to do a shout out. I think two of the First Light staff are on this, Ellie Oldock and Brett. I never know how to say Brett Chickatelli. They're just amazing and phenomenal people and do so much work through First Light. So just want to shout them out and thank them.
I'm so glad you did, Darren, and Ellie and Brett. Thank you for being with us today and for being in this work all the time. It's really amazing. And Darren, that you reminded me too that there's when we just talk about land back without going to the rematriation piece, there's this temptation to think it's about like property deeds, right? Like ownership of land. And that's not really what we're talking about. It really is about the cult. I mean, it's part of what we're talking about. But I really appreciate that. And Chuck, I wonder if you could share a little bit like more specific ways that the Penobscot have historically managed lands and waters, and what we should be thinking about, like what we should be looking forward to.
Definitely. So there's a lot of history out there that, you know, there's been some prescribed burning that was done back in the day to kind of manicure, you know, the undergrowth of the forest to do a little bit of, you know, basically it was in certain areas that we spent a lot of time, I guess, basically. And it would, you know, procure blueberries and raspberries and such, in some of those spots. There's also a lot of stories, you know, on, birch stream, which is traditional hunting territory. And oak isn't really like a, you know, prominent species in that area, but walking up through some of those areas, like along the ridges there's a lot of oak that you'll find in those areas. So they, you know, the idea is that folks just kind of picked up a bunch of acorns along the river and brought them inland more to those spots. And, you know, that's one other aspect of it. I'm trying to think of other good examples off the top of my head right now, but
I love that. That's super, super interesting. And there's a pace of that work that is maybe different. Maybe I'll just read this question instead of trying to translate in real time. There's engineered sort of organized restoration activities, but I think what you're describing is maybe a little bit of a slower natural restoration or rematriation. What is, am I starting to hit at something there?
so, yeah, it's more, you know, there's different things that you can do, like river restoration. That's pretty intensive work, like getting in and actually, you know, you're getting in the stream, you're building these areas to, you know, hold water back here and allow for pools and riffles. And whereas, you know, when you're going into a forest to let that kind of grow back, that's a long-term commitment to, you know, it's not something that you can just go in and, you know, one timber harvest isn't gonna, you know, create the habitat that you're looking for. Basically, you know, there's multiple entries that will need to take place. Trying to think of other, you know, aspects of, I mean, the other thing is, you know, we're kind of thinking more towards like this, you know, older growth forest, and we'd like to preserve some of those type of areas, but there's not a lot to preserve. So with the tribe 7th-generation approach, you're kind of, you know, that's one thing I want to look at with the Wáhsehtəkw lands and our other holdings is, you know, areas where we can create those reserves. And you know, it's not going to be old growth in my lifetime. It's not going to be old growth in River's lifetime, but hopefully, you know, a couple more generations out, they'll start seeing some of those benefits. But
Yeah, and I'd just say, just to add to that, Chuck, you know, like some of these core teachings we have as Wabanaki Penobscot people is like, this is why it's more like caretaking. You know, we were taught, and with so many of the things that are the environment, is that we take care of it, it will take care of us. That's why access and our, you know, actually fishing the fish, gathering the sweetgrass, you know, gathering the black ash, brown ash, you know, like those are the way we do those things facilitate the biodiversity and the ongoing kind of work of it. Whereas if you just throw, you know, lock people out of places and throw away the key, that doesn't actually nurture the environment in the way that we're taught. And so I think that's why you see these, you know, land return projects and the conservation outcomes and possibilities for restoration around them just be the highlights of so many projects around the world right now. So I just, you know, that's like just such a simple core teaching, but you know, the approach for conservation with easements at its root is more of a prevention mechanism, right? It's not a caretaking mechanism. So I think that's where this work has become exciting to a lot of people.
it's hard to, you know, kind of quantify things. Like I've never worked for an industrial forestry company. I started as a forester here. I was educated at Maine, but you know, as soon as I came here, you know, you learn a lot more when you're actually working in the field versus at the university. No offense, Darren, but you know how that real-time experience, you know, is definitely, that's how I learn anyway. And I think, it's important to, like I was talking about the old growth, it's important to have that across the landscape, but if we want to harvest moose, old growth forest isn't gonna be very productive for us. They're gonna go to our neighbors that are harvesting intensively. And, we still see that a little bit today, and so that's why it's kind of important to have a balance of both types of, management. And I think, that was probably one thing that, that we saw as we were doing those burnings in some of those areas where, you would create that new growth coming up, and that's just more attractive to wildlife as well. And then I wanted to touch on fishing too, and you brought it up the point of why it's important to gather, and to practice those cultural life ways. And I talked about fishing and how we can't eat many of the fish just because of the contaminants, and like our wives and children, and they're really not supposed to eat much of it at all because of developmental issues. And now my wife isn't going to have any more kids, so she's been partaking a little bit more with the striped bass with me. But so it's kind of, it's important to practice that still at this point in our age, and just to remember, I think remember what it was like to an extent. And also, we have treaty reserve sustenance fishing rights on the Penobscot for Atlantic salmon and well, for all species, but obviously salmon was the big one. But so that's another reason why it's really important to practice those rights, because someday, hopefully in not River's lifetime, maybe, but maybe beyond, we'll be able to, restore salmon at some point. But
I think one of the things to add on that I've observed and learned is access to the land isn't enough, in that, what Chuck and Darren are hitting on is restoring Penobscot Nation's sovereign ability to caretake for the land is what helps to ensure that hopefully some of those contaminants and that pollution can start to be reduced, because Penobscot Nation is bringing a different type of stewardship approach, and it's what helps to ensure that the health of the land and the health of Penobscot Nation is actually realized in that reciprocal way. So it's not just about access here, it's actually about really restoration of those caretaking rights and responsibilities for the health of the land and people.
Gonna take a lot more than us to solve the mercury issues, but we did
Fair.
our due diligence on some of the rest of it. So
So something coal-fired plants. I don't know. There's a whole, just shut all those down all at once. We'll be fine.
This is where we're all doing our piece of the work, right? We're all in it together, and we're all in, right? So one of the questions that I'm going to ask, I'm going to ask a question now that I cannot imagine the answer being like, who is there resistance to rematriation? Is there resistance to land back? I can't imagine why, but I'm holding my breath. Tell me.
I want to stop that there.
Yeah. I mean, yes, there is. I mean, I think it's, I think it's a new thing. It's a new practice for many of the organizations that MCV represents. I think it's really challenging to think of conservation work, for example, without easements for a lot of people who are practitioners in this field. Because that's sort of like, well, that's what we do. That is sort of the key practice for the last 70, 80 years of this work for thinking about success and thinking about like what the work is about. I also think, there's this real lag. Again, and I mentioned like increasing scholarship and practice in this area that is proving, again, in multiple different kinds of metrics, that this is producing some of the most important conservation and biodiversity kinds of outcomes, that there's a lag in that understanding. I mean, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the conservation set of practices was presuming just all humans were the problem, indigenous or not. Like, we have to nip in the bud that humans are this problem, and if we don't put a regulatory framework around it, then they're gonna harm. And I think this story starts from a different place, that in fact, until the last 400 or 500 years, human beings have been pretty good in supporting biodiversity and things like that. It's been this particular constellation of colonialism and capitalism and property as a commodity that has led us into this framework. And so I think that's a, anything new, I think, is going to always be that. But I find it like sometimes the boards of groups, of conservation groups, where they're not practitioners, so they're like, why are we doing this, diversity work when we should be doing conservation work? And they don't see it as like, actually, this is the current set of best practices, engaging Indigenous people, having this leadership and set of that's a shift that is being documented and practiced around the world. So I think, I'm not going to say, your board or anyone's board, I just think there's a lag time between practitioner and board people. Sometimes new work gets taken up unevenly across the practitioner communities as well. So I think that's always the case. I'm not faulting anyone. I'm just, the resistances are people operating in a different frame or story, right? That is humans, all humans are the problem, and that sort of thing. So yeah.
Betsy, you're reading my mind. I want to know how you're thinking about this at TPL, and how how land trusts can support land back while also maintaining the trust you have with your members and supporters, and how do we help sort of bring everybody to that place that Darren was describing of understanding current best practices and thinking and just a wider frame.
Thank you for that question, Kathleen. And I'm also going to take the opportunity to answer one of the resistance or barriers. It's not quite resistance, but there is also a lag time in public funding for tribal land return and tribal land acquisition. And that can be a big barrier right now that can be filled through philanthropic gifts and donations, but also a focus on policies and public funding programs that ensure tribes are eligible for land acquisition funding, and then that funding is structured in a way that honors and respects the sovereignty of tribal nations. So just wanted to put that policy call out in. And with respect to how Trust for Public Land thinks about this work and larger, the larger kind of organizational ecosystem here, I think at the core of Trust for Public Land from our very beginning has always been the importance of community and the importance of the relationship between people and land. And so it's in many ways for our organization very easy for us to put importance towards deferring to our tribal partners and Indigenous communities with respect to decision making over land, and our goal has long been to connect people and land. So that's organizationally specific and kind of at the heart of our DNA. But that being said, it's challenging when you are within a bigger system, whether it be federal funding or a system of state and federal agency partnerships, to make sure that we are upholding the direction and values of tribal partners. And so I would say one of the things that is key here is to not just do this within your own organization, but to really be thinking about how are we learning as a collective community, and how are we continuing to influence and advocate to public agencies, whether that's state or federal and elected officials, because the system has to work for the organizations that want to do this work to succeed, and of course for them, the tribal nations, to succeed.
Thank you for making those connections, and I'm going to take us one step further and ask how this work dovetails with the work of the Wabanaki Alliance and the work that many of the folks on this call have been engaged in with the Wabanaki Alliance around tribal sovereignty. And the little sub question to that is, does all this get easier when the state of Maine finally recognizes the inherent sovereignty of the Wabanaki nations, or what changes? Because we're all working for that moment.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. I think I saw Ambassador Bryant on here somewhere too. I don't know if she's still anyway. If she wants to pipe up, I think this would be important. But I mean, quite simply, I think these kinds of projects around land return, make the promise of sovereignty more easily kind of within our reach. I think I think if you had said, hey, we're you're gonna be able to start have land return projects a decade ago, and I would have been like, you're crazy, they don't want to, no one's gonna help us with that. Just feeling like no one supported us. So there's been this educational and transformational shift in this kind of workspace. But I think, the Alliance is much more focused on, tearing down the walls that prevent us from exercising our sovereignty. I think until those walls are fully, brought down, there will always be limits upon the kinds of practices that even we can do. Even in return lands, even in lands in trust, that there's a limited sort of regulatory and environmental protection that we can exercise. And so I think this highlights and makes some of the things promised through our sovereignty possible, but until the barriers are down, it still suffers from some of that. So I think Ambassador Bryant is can come on now to correct me what I said wrong.
Welcome, Ambassador. I think you should be able to unmute and join in if you'd like.
Yes, I think I just made you a co-host. Let me make sure.
Yeah, come on down. Hi there. Sorry, I'm in a drive-through with my daughter. I was running errands. Darren did a great job as usual. I just wanted to pop on and support the great work that they're all doing here. And it really does go hand in hand with a lot of what we're doing, because I think when people see the tribal nations being in good collaboration with other folks and having increased, determination and sovereignty over land and resources and people. And I think it breaks down a lot of the fear tactics and a lot of the resistance to kind of our overall quest for equity. So I think a lot of the same concepts align. And I'm so thankful to our allies in this work who are tirelessly showing that the Wabanaki nations are good friends, neighbors, and want what's best for the whole state, because it is our homeland. So great panel today. Happy to jump on and say a few words, and thanks so much for all the work you're all doing.
Thank you for being willing to jump in the midst of the rest of your life. So, and thank you to all of you for being with us today. Thank you for your great questions and comments. I wish we had the rest of the day together to be in this work. We know it is long-term work and it's based in relationships. So thank you for being with us in community virtually together, and for being with us in community for real out there. Chuck, Darren, Betsy, really, really appreciate your presentations and your comments today. Everyone else, you will get a follow-up email with lots of information and ways to support both the Wáhsehtəkw project and land back and rematriation more broadly, Wabanaki nations more broadly, and the work that we're all doing together. So thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and we'll be back in this space next week. There'll be information about next week's program on extended producer responsibility in the follow-up email. So register for that, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you three so much.